Hello everybody, just a quick announcement before we get started, just to say that this is the final episode in the current series of The Evolution of Horror, which means that we are going to be off the air here on the main feed for the next few months. Series 6 is over and Series 7 will be kicking off at some point in the summer of 2021. But have no fear. If you feel like there's going to be a big gaping EOH-shaped hole in your soul over the next couple of months, well, there's plenty of other content on our other channels. For example, we've got a YouTube channel, EOH TV. Over on that channel, you'll see video essays, you'll see reviews, interviews, festival coverage, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And this week, we are bringing you daily coverage of South by Southwest Festival. South by Southwest is an incredible festival and one that I'm able to access because it's virtual this year, of course. So me, Brad Hanson, and Louise Blaine are going to be covering all of the horror and genre and midnight movies at that festival, and we are going to be bringing you daily discussions and reviews over on EOH TV. So subscribe to us there at youtube.com/evolution of horror. And of course, you can also subscribe to our Patreon channel and get access to new episodes every single week. If you subscribe at a $5 per month level, you'll get a minimum of 2 bonus episodes per month to listen to. But if you subscribe at a $10 level, you'll get a new episode every single week that'll take you all the way through to the beginning of Series 7 on the main feed. So what are you waiting for? Get involved. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. This week, we reach the end of our Mind and Body series. I can't believe it. We've done it. 35 episodes covering over 100 years of psychological and body horror. It's been absolutely incredible. So this week is going to work as a little conclusion. It's just me, although I will be very briefly joined by Freudian cinephile Mary Wild later on in this episode to lend us her thoughts and how it's been for her recording her Wild About Horror segments with me throughout this series. Later on in the episode, I'll also be reading some listener feedback, I'll be answering some listener questions, and I'm going to finish by counting down both the listeners' and my top 10 mind and body movies. And stay tuned to the very end of the episode when I will be giving you all a little bit of information about Series 7 of The Evolution of Horror. But first of all, we need to finish Series 6. So let's have a little look back at what we've learned over the last 35 weeks as we conclude our series on the mind and body.
The mind and the body, they're the two things that we've all got, are the two things we actually have surprisingly little control over. Nature's going to get you one way or the other, and so I'm never going to be bitten by a vampire. I'm never going to get turned into a werewolf. I am getting older. I am going to suffer those things that come with age with the mind and the body, and so yes, it's a terrifying prospect.
The world must prepare for a potential coronavirus pandemic. That's the warning from the head of the World Health Organization.
When I originally planned a series on horror of the mind and body, I obviously wasn't aware that we were about to experience a global pandemic and that we'd all be locked in our homes for an entire year. How's 2020 been for you?
I am slowly rotting in my apartment. I've been here for 8 months. You know how it is in 2020.
But in a way, there was no better time to explore human horror, the horror of ourselves. Not monsters, not ghosts, not zombies, but us?
Just trying to take everything day by day. The world is crazy. The events within this world are crazy. And it's a very strange time, but I think it's a good time to bring conversation to horror and expand the conversation in the horror community, because we deal with this stuff in our entertainment quite a bit.
Of course, we didn't really need a viral outbreak and a year of isolation to discover just how fragile our bodies and our minds can be. After all, cinema has been exploring these horrors forever.
I mean, it's always been an absolute terror. People were always outcast right back from the, very early days. The mentally ill, the physically ill were left to die and just, abandoned. So it's always been something I think we've been absolutely terrified by.
So what do we mean by horror of the mind and horror of the body? Well, put simply, this series was all about human horror and outliers. These were movies that I couldn't put anywhere else. The weird and wonderful films that didn't fit in a specific subgenre or category. Maybe they were on the cusp of being art house movies or on the cusp of being mainstream thrillers. Maybe they were simply too extreme to be covered in a simple slasher series. These were the weird little outliers that didn't belong, and all of them tended to focus their horror on internal states, whether that be physical states or psychological ones. What I found perhaps most interesting about these two strands of horror is how differently they're generally perceived by audiences.
Repulsion, a terrifying look at the dark side of innocence, losing control.
Horror of the mind tends to be extremely well respected, and so-called psychological horror has always been considered somehow more high-end or cerebral. Sometimes, if it's lucky, it even loses its dirty horror label altogether and gets promoted to thriller.
Dr. Lecter, my name is Clarice Starling. May I speak with you?
You're one of Jack Crawford's, aren't you?
Body horror, on the other hand, tends to provoke the opposite reaction. When people think of eyeballs popping out, skin peeling off, or faces melting, they somehow immediately dismiss that as simply exploitation or trash.
That's disgusting.
These binary attitudes towards horror of the mind versus horror of the body seem to have existed since the birth of cinema itself. One of the first quote-unquote psychological horror films is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a cerebral German expressionist film about a serial killer that potentially takes place entirely in a character's mind.
You shouldn't be able to get too close to something so disturbing. It doesn't want you to get too close to it. I think really of the great mantra that drives the asylum director mad towards the end of the film, that flashback within a flashback. You must become Caligari. You kind of have to get into a similar accommodation with this film. You have to let it take you over, maybe even possess you, and good lord, I mean, there's no other way to approach it, really. It's fiendishly complicated. It's almost the Mulholland Drive of the 1920s.
We accept her, we accept her. Google gobble, Google gobble.
Then, a few years later, you get Todd Browning's Freaks, a body horror film that was chopped to pieces by censors, slated by critics, and supposedly made audiences physically ill.
A pregnant woman who miscarried while watching it and tried to sue MGM over it because it was such a disgusting film. And I think it was so shocking. I mean, it kind of put MGM off horror films. They didn't make that many after that, to be honest. And Todd Browning's career wasn't quite the same.
Cut to 60 years later, at the beginning of the 1990s, you've got The Silence of the Lambs, a terrifying psychological horror movie, for some reason labelled a thriller, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture.
And the Oscar goes to The Silence of the Lambs.
Meanwhile, around a similar time, you have Brian Usner's Society, not quite so critically acclaimed.
the thing that people never talk about in terms of society is kind of the beauty of that last sequence.
Yes.
Like, obviously it's gross, but it is kind of beautiful as well. There's something like it's beautiful kind of tableau that you see. You know, it feels like, you know, you think about like Salvador Dali's The Great Masturbator, or you think of Hieronymus Bosch.
Yeah.
You know, there's something kind of painterly and ornate and extravagant and beautiful about it.
Even in the 21st century, we don't like to acknowledge or be confronted with the abject grossness of our bodies. Blood, shit, pus, puke, cum. These are words that still make some people recoil, and certainly things that people don't want to see on screen.
100% medically accurate. One digestive system. Is this a perverted film you've been talking about?
But the mind. We love the idea of the human mind being something so powerful, so mysterious, so capable of things that even today we are not able to grasp. When films focus on horror that takes place inside the human mind, it's worthy of so much more critical praise.
Taking you inside the mind of a girl driven to insanity.
Up until the 1960s, the horror genre was much more focused on non-human antagonists. Monsters, vampires, werewolves, mummies, giant atomic monsters, aliens from outer space. But moving into the 1960s, perhaps off the back of the success of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, filmmakers became much more interested in psychopaths rather than monsters. Roman Polanski's Repulsion is another example of a terrifying horror movie that was somehow elevated to being worthy of art house criticism.
Carol Ledoux, possessed by the nightmare world of her sensual fantasies.
It's a very quiet disintegration of the brain, I think.
Yeah, it is.
And there are these moments where she's just walking around the streets as normal, and suddenly she sees a crack in the pavement, and then she just has to sit and look at the crack. And that's all you get.
And it's often psychological horror or horror of the mind that's linked with respected auteurs of cinema. This series we focused on a whole bunch of so-called auteurs and the way in which they often explore horror of the mind in different challenging ways. From Darren Aronofsky and his disturbing headfuck Requiem for a Dream.
I think it's a brilliant film. I think it's brilliant but absolutely harrowing. And this is like, you know, in your face, take no prisoners, you know, it's like a bruising experience to watch this film.
To Lars von Trier and his harrowing Antichrist.
I watched it and I was kind of in shock by it, the whole film. I think it's an amazing, amazing piece of work.
But there are two auteurs that we focused on more than any other this series. Both emerged around the mid-70s and both still working today. One very much associated with dreams, the mind and the subconscious. The other very much associated with decay, disease and the destruction of human flesh. These are, of course, David Lynch and David Cronenberg.
David Lynch is just like the, you know, bless him, he's the weirdest man on the planet. He's lovely, but it's so odd. And please don't ask me to ever explain what a David Lynch film is about, because there's no explanation. There's just a feeling, there's just a reaction that you have to it, and everybody has their own reaction to David Lynch.
But if there's one thing that exploring Lynch and Cronenberg has taught us, it's that this whole mind and body binary doesn't really exist. David Cronenberg's movies are just as much psychological horrors as they are body horrors.
After all, there is nothing real outside our perception of reality, is there?
I mean, the problem is that we know reality is fracturing for Max from really early on. He slaps his secretary, the secretary was saying was nice, and then and she turns into Debbie Harry's character, and then she turns back, and then he apologises, and she says, "Oh, but you didn't hit me." So we know, and this is really early on, that what we're seeing can't be trusted. And unfortunately, that splinters into so many different avenues of what might be happening.
David Lynch is very much a filmmaker with an art house reputation. In fact, some people are intimidated by the idea of even dipping their toe into the world of David Lynch. It's often assumed his movies are going to be pretentious, confusing, impenetrable, and alienating. But of course, this isn't the case. His first film, Eraserhead, is just as much a gruey, gruesome, trashy body horror as it is a psychological movie.
It is who thinks this baby is cute? I don't understand. It doesn't even have any skin. Like, it's not, it can't be cute. It's that early scene with Mary when she's feeding it, when you first see the baby, and it's like spitting up food. That's absolutely disgusting. It's so creepy, and as you say, no one knows what it is.
And there are many other movies we've discussed this series which perfectly balance the idea of mind horror and body horror. Look at Andrzej Zulawski's Possession.
I think it's one of those films, the reason I think that primarily it's been has gained a cult following and people keep talking about it and keep thinking about it and either really revile it or find it really dense and rich with ideas, is because it is sort of shifting. Like, you can see it as so many things and it kind of works on all of those levels. I don't think there's any one person who can say definitively this is what this film is, because it's about 10 or 12 different films in one.
Or Jonathan Glazer's Under the Skin, which takes us inside the mind of our main character as she gets used to a brand new body.
We have her body being a vessel, a conduit for a bigger plan, a bigger idea as to that we're never really shared narratively why, what, how, when, but also her mind as it shifts and alters as she becomes more human, as she assimilates into the culture that she's been thrust upon. This is the perfect embodiment of mind and body.
Or of course, Brian De Palma's Carrie. Is there another horror film that is so perfectly about the loss of control of a character's mind and a character's body?
Trust me, Carrie. You can trust me. Trust me, Carrie.
You know, I think that's what's kind of interesting talking about Carrie today will be, I think this idea of kind of mind and body of this series, and it's quite a kind of abstract idea. And in many ways, I think Carrie's one of the perfect films that does kind of incorporate those two things. It's like this season could be based around Carrie. It is purely mind and body.
Every single week, in reaction to the films we discuss throughout this series, there is one comment that has cropped up from listeners again and again and again. People reacting to the film we're discussing by saying, I thought this film was brilliant, but incredibly difficult to watch. We'll probably never sit through it again. And that's because horror of the mind and horror of the body is also where the most extreme end of cinema lies. You don't get much extreme cinema that's about vampires, or extreme cinema that's about zombies. Extreme cinema, in order to get that label extreme, it tends to be about human beings doing unspeakable things to other human beings. The movies we as audiences find the most difficult to watch are the ones about us.
I would say the side of it that I'm not as keen on is stuff like guinea pig and that kind of end of it. I mean, obviously that's an extreme example, but things where it is human pain for pain's sake, I'm not as into that. Torture porn, that kind of stuff.
The whole torture porn era with American movies, the Eli Roth stuff, all the Saw movies, I never got into those.
Throughout this series, I looked at the trend of extreme and violent movies that were released around the world at the turn of the millennium and into the 2000s. For some reason, this was a decade that was absolutely rife with bloodthirsty torture movies. From Takashi Miike's Audition over in Japan, to Eli Roth's Hostel in North America, to Pascal Logier's Martyrs in France. These movies differed in terms of how they handled the subject of torture and pain, and the reaction to them, both critically and commercially, tended to vary. But the difference between these movies and, let's say, a typical gory slasher or zombie movie is that these films weren't so much focused on the kills and more on the pain.
It's living with these characters who are in trauma. They're in traumatic experiences, and you're with them. And I always think that's the kind of, it's not a test, but you have to kind of say, like, I'm going to engage with this, and I'm going to go on this journey.
And no matter how hardened we are as horror fans, that's still something we're not entirely comfortable with witnessing. Human beings in pain.
The first time I watched this, I watched it by myself, and at one point I said out loud, like, okay, that's enough.
Yeah.
I had my fill. And it's the movie just haunted me, and it still haunts me.
This last year, we've probably all been a lot more terrified of our own minds and our own bodies than we have been about serial killers or deadly animals or occultist devil worshippers coming to get us. At times, the films that I've put myself and the rest of you through this series have been challenging, confrontational, even at times unwatchable.
I do not envy the films that you've been watching. And I was saying to you earlier, I listened to your discussion about Hostel and Cabin Fever, and I loved your discussion about Martyrs, but they all made me really glad that I wasn't watching them.
But I've also found them cathartic, fascinating, and even somewhat helpful. Whether it's the story of a woman suffering with mental illness and living in isolation in her own flat in Repulsion, or a teenage boy thinking the end of the world and the destruction of the human race is imminent in Donnie Darko, or even a heartbreaking horror film about a man learning to live with a deadly degenerative disease in The Fly.
I don't accept that. There must be something we can do, somebody we can go to, a test that can be done.
No! I won't be just another tumorous bore talking endlessly about his hair falling out in his lost lymph nodes.
No matter how hard we try and avoid it, the scariest things we simply cannot escape are our minds and bodies. We simply have to live with the ones we've got.
Just the fact that you can't get away from it, and it's so real, but it's all to do with sex and disease and contagion and mutations, and we're all trapped in our own bodies. And it's kind of other elements of horror, be it ghosts, be it monsters, be it vampires. You kind of know it's fantastical, and maybe it doesn't scare you quite so much, but we all know that things are going to go wrong with us, that parts are going to stop working and drop off. And I've always been a hypochondriac ever since I was a kid, that the slightest twinge or anything like that, I'm convinced it's a tumour or something's wrong with me. So I've always been very, very aware of it.
Body horror and psychological horror will likely never go away, because, much like us, these films are always going to be challenging, they're always going to be gross, they're always going to be divisive, and they are always going to be absolutely terrifying. And there we go. On that note, I want to say a huge thank you to every single one of my guests who joined me this series. The biggest guest list we've ever had for a series of this podcast. I'm going to start by thanking all of our regulars who came back to join me to talk about mind and body movies. So a big thank you to Kevin Lyons, James Swanton, Rihanna Dillon, Jen Handorf, Michael Blythe, Mike Lee Graham, Anna Bugutskaya, Prano Bailey Bond, Jamie Graham, Lou Thomas, Becky Dark, Brad Hanson, Alex Ailing, Tim Coleman, Eleanor Lazic, Adam Robinson, Louise Blaine, Dan Martin, Zobo with a Shotgun, Sam Ashurst, Giles Edwards, Rob Watts, Ollie Charles, Stevie Webb, and Rosie Fletcher. A huge thank you, as ever, to all of those wonderful regular contributors. And I want to say a second little special thanks to all of our newcomers this season. I had so many brilliant new guests, all of which I want back in the next series if I can. So a huge thank you to Pamela Hutchinson, Steph McKenna, Matt Glasby, James and Matt from Journey Through Sci-Fi, Kelly Weston, Michael Leader, Catherine Bray, Lee Singer, Alex West, Stacey Ponder, and some brilliant interviewees from this series. Star of The Human Centipede 2, Lawrence Harvey, star of Under the Skin, Adam Pearson, and director of Possessor, none other than Brandon Cronenberg. What an incredible guest list this series has had. So one more time, a huge thank you to all of those people. Now, of course, there's one name that I missed out there from that list. One person who I need to say a special thank you to, because for the first time on the Evolution of Horror, I've had a kind of regular partner on this podcast, somebody who's been on almost every single episode with me. She has been just an absolute joy to work with throughout this entire journey, bringing me her unique little segments, lending her Freudian perspective to each and every film we cover. So I wanted to say a special thank you to her in person. So she's popped by, joining me for the last time this series, Freudian cinephile Mary Wild. Hello.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. I was trying to replicate my usual intro in the segment.
I love it. Well, this is really nice because it's been a while since we've actually spoken to each other on the podcast properly, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
It feels like a long time ago now, way back at the beginning of recording this Mind and Body season. I can't remember when it was, maybe last May or something when we chatted. So it's been quite a journey. Here we are, still on lockdown,
yeah.
But you know, how have you found it personally, kind of, you know, watching all of these movies with me and sort of working your way through them as well?
Well, it's been so interesting because obviously I totally understood when you invited me on board for this series. This really is a topic that is very close to my heart. It's some, you know, mind and body and the kind of like physiological and psychological components of horror that we see depicted in these films. Mm-hmm. It's so much of the research that I conduct anyway for my courses. But I have to say, like, I've really, really enjoyed this process of producing the segments every week and kind of like returning to these films and really trying to kind of create something concise and for this different format, I guess, as well, where it's just like a segment. And I wanted to share something with you because, I mean, I wouldn't classify myself as a writer. I don't feel ever like the compulsion or the kind of inspiration to sit down and write and put pen to paper or sit down and like produce something and, you know, in just purely writing format. Mm-hmm. But, I felt really inspired producing these little segments for this series. And I really love the dimension of narrating them. I think that's more my cup of tea, like the performance aspect.
Yeah.
And I have to say, like, I feel like I've found a little bit of my voice, like my kind of my acting,
yes,
my voice acting style.
Oh, you nailed it, Mary. I could tell that just from listening to the way that your little segments have evolved from the start of the series to the end, and it feels like you're kind of really kind of loving it and relishing it in the sort of latter half, you know.
Yeah.
And that's been really cool, yeah. And I know for a fact, because so many people have been in touch and people have commented and people have emailed saying how much they've really enjoyed your segments as well and kind of given it a kind of extra dimension for this particular topic as well. So thank you so much on behalf of everyone listening as well for everything that you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity and thank you for your wonderful listeners who've been so kind in their feedback. That's lovely.
What have been some of the highlights for you in terms of the films that we've covered and the ones that you've gotten to talk about? Are there any that particularly stood out to you as ones that you really enjoyed kind of exploring?
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, it goes without saying that the auteur kind of, you know, all the episodes that you did covering films by the same director, those probably do rank pretty high for me, just because I love auteur studies and I love kind of really immersing myself in the vision of a director, like a singular vision.
Yeah.
And also, obviously, Lars von Trier and David Lynch are my two of my favorite directors.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to say, the highlight for me has to have been The Human Centipede 2.
It's so funny. I literally was just saying as well about how that was one of my favourite episodes to record as well, just because it's a film that I didn't really expect to like or to enjoy talking about, but there's so much interesting stuff there to explore, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I wouldn't have predicted that would have been my favorite episode to like really think about and research and then record something on. I would have never thought that it would have been that film for the whole series, but but for some reason, I think maybe it's because I took the time the week prior to recording. I sat down and I rewatched all 3 films in a sequence.
God, I'm so sorry.
And it kind of like, because I said in that segment that the first Human Centipede is the thing that scared me the most, like the film out of all the films I've ever watched that has scared me the most. So it kind of gave me a chance to kind of come back and reconnect with that fear, but do it in almost like a safe way, because I had an aim, I had a project.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Felt, like it put some safe parameters around there. And I'm really relieved that I did. I think I kind of like cured myself a little bit of that fear.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that. And I think that's what I found really interesting about this series, because these are, for one reason or another, all of these are very challenging movies, I think, aren't they? They're challenging in the way that sometimes they're quite difficult to get your head around if it's a movie like Inland Empire, or it's very challenging emotionally, like Requiem for a Dream or Martyrs, and then sometimes it's just physically challenging with something like Human Centipede, and a lot of these movies are quite hard to take, and I think part of this exploration of watching these movies and then reading about them and talking about them really helps kind of work your own way through them, doesn't it, in that sort of way. It's been really nice. It's been like a kind of therapy.
Oh yeah, totally. It's very cathartic. I mean, that's why I really strongly encourage people who say that they wouldn't necessarily turn to horror films, they're scared. Like, those are the very people that maybe should be watching them, because there's something else they're scared about that is not necessarily the film. It's the mechanism of fear itself and how to resolve it. So whenever someone says, I'm too scared of horror films to watch them, that's like saying I'm too covered up in dirt to take a bath. You're the person that needs it the most. You know what I mean?
That is perfectly put. Exactly. Yeah, you're so right. It's been a really interesting journey, and I suppose something that I didn't predict and nobody could have really predicted when I was planning this season is what actually then ended up happening in the real world while we were recording it. And I think there's something about the horror of us, right? The human horror, which is, I suppose, really what we've been looking at this series, not monsters or vampires or anything else. It's us. And so many movies, whether it's Repulsion, which looks at a woman alone in isolation in a flat, or movies about viruses or disease or death, and like, I don't know, there's something of an extra layer to it, I think, coincidentally, that came about this last year. Do you know what I mean?
I do. That's really well put. I mean, absolutely. I think with movies that are so centralized around the human psyche and our own bodies, as you say, where the fear object is not externalized, it's not some monster out there trying to get us, it's our own condition, it's our own subjectivity or our own body. That's kind of like a very confronting thing, because there is no escape. We can't escape ourselves. And
that's it.
And the fact that it's just very fortuitous that this came out when it did during this period. Your season was really like timely, because we were in the process of lockdown and quarantine, facing ourselves and facing maybe our own worst or darkest impulses. So it's like a perfect. I think your series is particularly your podcast in general, but your series this time around has really just been like, it couldn't have been better timed.
I know. I was thinking, is it better timed, or is it the worst possible time? Because a lot of the time, I'm sure people probably were thinking, oh God, this is not what I want to be thinking about right now. Because and again, it's been this has been a very difficult time for people, both on their physical health and on their mental health, right? And so what I'm hoping is, like what you've said, is that these movies have been in some way a form of catharsis for that. Let's hope, at least, we haven't turned too many people off.
I think you've helped. I think you've kind of like eliminated huge therapy fees from people's budgets. Like
that's what I like to think. Exactly.
Yeah.
Amazing. So, I mean, we did this. I mean, initially I asked you to do this because I thought, well, this season is so perfectly suited to everything you love and all of your expertise. And it was originally kind of meant to be just something that we were going to do for just this one season. But I think we've both enjoyed it so much, and I think people have enjoyed it so much listening that, Mary, I'd love us to do more of this. I mean, would you be interested in coming back and doing more of these segments next season?
Absolutely. A resounding yes. I'm honored to be asked. First of all, thank you so much.
Oh, of course.
I mean, just the opportunity to do this, something that I love so much and I feel so passionately about, and also to be a part of this wonderful community you've created, this wonderful horror fans community, is a huge honor. I'm so flattered, and a huge resounding yes, I'd love to.
Amazing. Fantastic. Oh, well, I can't wait. We got, I'm sure, lots more interesting stuff to explore in the next season. So that'll be very exciting. Awesome. And what's, before we finish, is there anything else going on for you, Mary, that you want to talk about or that you want to plug? Any more upcoming courses or anything happening with Projections Podcast or anything like that?
Yeah. So with Projections Podcast, which I co-host with Sarah Cleaver, of course. So we've got our sixth series coming up soon ourselves. It's going to be The Double. So doppelganger and twins and lookalikes and like
fantastic
clones, this kind of thing. It's a big topic in psychoanalysis. So we're going to be covering that over 6 episodes. Apart from that, so with my courses, I do have one that would probably be of interest to your listeners on the death drive. So the Freudian death drive, the impulse to not exist, or the impulse to like retreat from life, basically. There are some horror elements within that, of course. And that's going to be hosted by the Freud Museum London. It is an online course, and it's open to people internationally. And it's happening on the 19th and 20th of March.
Fantastic. Oh, well, that sounds perfect. Wonderful. Well, Mary, thank you again. It's been such an incredible experience working with you on this. And I already can't wait for next series.
Me too. It's been a pleasure working with you.
Have a lovely break from the evolution of horror, and make sure if there's one thing I've learned, it's look after your body and look after your mind, Mary. They're the only ones we've got.
Words to live by. And a huge shout out also to all of the people in the Facebook discussion group, the Evolution of Horror Facebook discussion group. Yes. Literally the only reason why I haven't deleted Facebook.
I know, you're so right. I was actually saying that exact same thing on the group the other day. It's like, this is the only reason I come to Facebook still. They've been brilliant. Well, Mary, thank you so much. And just one more time, remind us where they can find you on Twitter if they want to find out any more details about what you've got going on.
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at Psychstar, PSYCSTAR.
Brilliant. Mary, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike. Bye.
Good evening. And thank you for allowing me to come into your living rooms.
Are you crazy? I hope so. With all my heart, I hope I'm crazy. We all go a little mad sometimes.
Two fellows meet accidentally, like you and me. No connection between them at all. Never saw each other before. Each one has somebody that he'd like to get rid of.
A man is assaulting a woman at 125 West 9th Street, second floor, at the rear. Now, make it fast.
They're coming! They're coming!
That was a little clip you just heard there from our Hitchcock mini-season, our exclusive mini-series available only for $10 and $20 patrons. The first 2 parts are already available. In part 1, me and Rihanna discussed the 39 Steps and The Lady Vanishes. In part 2, we discussed Hitchcock's break into Hollywood with deep dive discussions of Rebecca and Shadow of a Doubt. And part 3, coming next week, is going to include include deep dive discussions of Notorious and one of my personal favourites, Rope. Cannot wait. So that's what we've got going on over on Patreon at the moment. Not just a Hitchcock mini-season, but also if you sign up at a $10 level, you'll get access to our Saw mini-season, which has also been so much fun. Last week, me, Louise Blaine and Rob Watts discussed Saw 2 and Saw 3 back to back. So in the next episode, we'll be covering Saw 4 and Saw 5. We're going to be working our way through the entire franchise in the hope that come May, if it actually gets the release that it's slated to get, we'll be covering the brand new Saw movie starring Chris Rock, Spiral. So even though our Mind and Body series is coming to an end, you can still get regular episodes for the Evolution of Horror every single week over on Patreon. The next season of the podcast won't be starting until the summer, so Patreon will be the only way you'll get access to weekly content. So if you want to sign up, get involved. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. You can sign up at a $3 level, which is just basic support. You'll also get access to newsletters and can vote in Patreon-only polls. $5 will get you regular bonus episodes, at least 2 per month. This week, for $5 donors, we're bringing an episode reviewing The Dark and the Wicked and the new Wrong Turn movie. You'll also have a whole back catalogue of nearly 100 episodes now that you can listen to as a $5 donor. But if you move up to the $10 level, you will get access to the aforementioned mini-seasons. So the Hitchcock retrospective, the Saw retrospective, there's also an entire mini-season on the Twin Peaks saga from beginning to end, and an entire mini-season on extreme cinema. You can still listen to all of those right now. Finally, you could choose to sign up at a $20 per month level, and for that, you get absolutely everything. You also get a special video message from me as a thank you, and you become an official Evolution of Horror sponsor, which means you'll get your very own dedicated segment in a future episode of the main podcast. Everybody who signs up from the UK will get sent an Evolution of Horror sticker, and everybody who signs up, no matter where they're from, will get a very special shout out on the podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the last couple of weeks a very special thanks. So, a big thank you to Luke Allen, Emily Randall, Betsy Webster, Jay Demi, Keith Dooley, Don Ventura, Emily West, Adam Narr, Ben Ridgeton, Megan KD, Sean Parry, Schluff, Will M, Darius Commons, Lucy Buglas, Kevin Sweeney, Ian Young, James Barter, Jennifer Trudrung, and Amanda Ray. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up. And one more time, if you want to join them, if you want to help support the making of this podcast and continue to listen to episodes while we are off the air on the main feed, then sign up now. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. That's patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. Okay, we are going to finish this series with some mailbag. So I want to thank all of you actually for sending me so many lovely emails and comments. I mean, mostly lovely, throughout this entire series. You guys have also, in your droves, submitted your top 5s and top 10s films of this subgenre, so we will finish this episode by counting down the listeners' top 10s. But first of all, I'm going to read and respond to some listener emails. So I'm sorry that I'm not going to get time to read out absolutely everybody's emails, but I'm going to read a few here. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative, and some of them have questions that I can answer. So let's start with this email from Trina Findley, friend of the pod, and she's been a $20 patron and EOH sponsor. Trina Findley. Trina says, "Hi Mike, this season couldn't have been more timely in the global context. This might have influenced the fact that, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, I found getting through this Mind and Body season something of a slog. Not because the content was anything less than top-notch, of course, but just because of the subject matter. I looked through the episode list and was surprised to see that the first episode was June 2020. It feels like Un Chien Andalou was about 10 years ago. I feel like I've been through the emotional ringer with some of the films I've discovered, like Antichrist, and films I've rewatched, like Martyrs. And this was the first season where I've decided not to watch the films based on your reviews, e.g. Human Centipede 2, only because I don't think my mental health is resilient enough to cope with the scenes you've described. So, as others have already said, thank you for watching so I don't have to. Thank you very much, Trina, for that lovely comment. We got quite a few emails that sounded a bit like that, and I will read a couple more, sort of people saying that, maybe it's because of the films themselves, but maybe it's also because of this last year. But some people have found the films covered this series particularly difficult. And of course, they are. Movies like Martyrs and Human Centipede 2 and Antichrist are incredibly difficult to watch. And that's why I've tried to emphasise as much as possible this series. If you don't want to watch some of these films, please don't feel compelled to. Hopefully you can still listen to the discussions and still get something out of it. So thank you so much for that lovely email, Trina. This email comes from George Furman. He has similar things to say. He said, "Hi Mike, I have to say, in terms of the films covered, this has been my least favourite series so far. It's been a mix of either pretentious art house films that I wouldn't consider horror, or stuff that's so extreme, like Martyrs and the Human Centipede, that I don't really want to sit through it. Because of that, this is the first series where I haven't watched along week by week, but simply listened to the discussions instead. Despite all this, I've absolutely loved it. I think the conversations you've had with your guest are top-notch and have always been inviting and accessible. So, even for someone like me who hadn't watched most of the films, I was still able to enjoy and get something out of each and every conversation. That being said, I'm hoping you return to some more fun traditional horror for your next series. Thank you for everything you do, and congratulations on yet another triumphant season." Thank you so much, George, for that lovely email. And again, totally get it. I understand. I knew that this particular series was going to be a bit controversial in terms of the films covered. And I really appreciate all of you still listening every single week, even if you don't necessarily want to watch those films. And again, I kind of hope that despite all of that, some of the conversations have been interesting to listen to, because I think, regardless of how much I've enjoyed some of these movies, and some of them I really didn't, I've actually found the conversations that I've had around them some of the most fascinating ones I've had since starting this podcast. So thank you very much. This email comes from Mark Holland. Mark says, "I wanted to say how much I have enjoyed this season and countless hours of joys it has brought me throughout this difficult year. I discovered your podcast at the start of this season and have now pretty much watched every film you've covered, many of which were new discoveries for me. And I have also discovered Twin Peaks for the first time and really enjoyed listening to your mini-series on Patreon. Along with your folk horror season, I have enjoyed Mind and Body the most and found the history and development of the genre really fascinating, from its origins in German Expressionism through to the experimental psychological horror of the 60s, the gory body horror of the 80s, the 90s thrillers, and the more art house inspired horrors of recent years like Under the Skin. I've also really enjoyed diving headfirst into the minds of David Lynch and David Cronenberg." Thank you very much for that lovely email, Mark. I kind of agree with you. You mentioned there the different facets of this series, the different eras and the different types of movies we discussed. That was certainly something for me that was a big draw. There was a big positive in terms of this series, was that it was so vague and so amorphous, and it meant that I got to explore lots of different elements of horror. Personally, for me, I find that more enjoyable, I think, than the sort of more rigid subgenres like slashers or zombie movies, where I'm covering what is virtually the same format week in and week out. So that's definitely it's been varied, this series, which I've really enjoyed. This email comes from Vincent Gain. Vincent says, "Hi Mike, thank you so much for another fantastic season. My Mind and Body might just be my favourite yet. The range of films, the scope of topics, and the variety of guests have made for a set of tremendous discussions and a wonderful wonderful comfort during these very difficult months. I do need to raise one issue. In your serial killer episode with Brad Hansen, the two of you brought up Jack the Ripper and referred to his victims as prostitutes. Historical research has found evidence that only one of the Whitechapel murder victims, Mary Jane Kelly, was definitely a sex worker. There's an entire book devoted to this study, which I recommend anyone read if they are interested in this topic. The Five, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhold. In the aftermath of recent events such as Me Too, the Weinstein and Whedon scandals, and the tragic death of Sarah Everard, it is all the more important that we challenge ingrained misogyny and pay attention to the victims of male assault. On a lighter note, my top episode of the entire series was your chat with Lee Singer on the films of Darren Aronofsky. You and Lee highlighted the way the film creates horror of the body and mind through editing and cinematography, and I was hopping with glee. I was especially pleased that you mentioned Mother in passing because I adore that film too. Thank you so much, Vincent. And then Vincent goes on to list his top 10. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for flagging that, Vincent. You're absolutely right. You know, sometimes when you get lost in a discussion, you sort of glaze over certain points. But you're right. You know, I apologise about the fact that me and Brad mentioned that most of Jack the Ripper's victims, or I can't remember exactly what we said, but if we alluded to all of them being sex workers, that is clearly apparently not the case. If anyone does want to sort of read up a little bit more about that topic, I certainly think I should, and I'm going to read this book that Vincent has recommended, The Five, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhold. Thank you so much for that feedback, and thank you so much for that recommendation, Vincent. I will definitely check that out. This email comes from Sarah New. Sarah says, I've been listening to the podcast for ages, and it's definitely one of my favourites, and I would recommend it to nearly everyone I know. Thank you, Sarah. I've really enjoyed this series, but must ask, why would you not include the best body horror film of all time, Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit? Unless, of course, you're saving it for a werewolf series. To be completely serious, I love the podcast, and I think you're doing a great job. Hoping to become a Patreon when I eventually get off furlough and know what's going on with my job. Thank you so much. Listening along always feels like I'm chatting about horror films with a friend. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that lovely, lovely message. And yes, I mean, I can't disagree with that, Sarah. Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit is one of the greatest movies ever made. And absolutely, rest assured, when I come to doing a monster series and particularly a kind of werewolf strand, we will be covering that film. Don't you worry. Thank you so much. I debated whether or not to read out this next email, whether or not it was worth giving it any of my time at all, but I decided I'm gonna, because I think it's important for me to respond to it. This email comes from Pete. I won't say his last name. Pete. Mike, why, after you promised to stop pushing your left-wing political agenda at the end of the last series, did you then begin this series immediately by plugging all of that Black Lives Matter stuff? That's not what we tune into a horror podcast to hear. Please give it a rest. Okay, I'll keep this answer brief, just to say that yes, at the end of the Occult series, I did say that I was going to stop being so vocally anti-conservative on the podcast, which I think I've done a pretty good job of doing. I'm never going to stop talking about politics in the context of horror, because all horror is political. However, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, that is not a political thing. That's not a left-wing, right-wing thing. That's simply a human rights thing. And if you have a problem with that, and I know a couple of you did, a couple of you tweeted me about it at the time, then please, by all means, unsubscribe. Okay, let's move on to the next email. This one comes from Tim Farrell. Tim says, I've absolutely loved this series of EOH, and I've been meaning to send love ever since you name-checked Brackage's Act of Seeing on the intro episode. I saw it at uni during a final year horror film subject, one of the few things that made me so nauseous I had my head in my hands for most of it. Over the course of the series, I've realised this is probably my favourite subgenre, but since having kids, I'm no longer into rushing into the extreme end of the spectrum. I'm saving Martyrs for a special occasion, and as such, I haven't listened to Alex West's episode yet. Did you mention Anatomy of Hell? It's not strictly a horror film, but definitely an also-ran the way the woman presents her unwatchable body and bodily functions to the man. Finally, one more also-ran to throw up is Sick, The Life and Death of Bob Flanagan, Sadomasochist. Have you seen it? A fantastic and sensitive documentary about a man overcoming the pain and frustration caused by his failing body due to cystic fibrosis. Almost the perfect synthesis of the mind and body theme. Wishing you all the best from Oz in these dark times. Wow, thank you so much, Tim. I have not seen either of those films you mentioned. Anatomy of Hell, which sounds horrible, and Sick, The Life and Death of Bob Flanagan, Sadomasochist. I haven't seen either of those. That second one, that documentary, sounds fascinating / grueling. I will definitely try and check them out. Thank you so much for that lovely feedback. This message comes from Ethan Sanders. Ethan said, I've thoroughly enjoyed this series, especially as body horror is one of my favourite subgenres. Another body horror classic you could bring up in your also-rans is the 1957 The Incredible Shrinking Man. The film manages to tell a compelling story that sets a template for future body horrors such as The Fly. The ending is also beautifully poetic with such a powerful monologue. Thank you so much, Ethan. I haven't seen The Incredible Shrinking Man. As ever, there are too many films to squeeze into one season here, but maybe I'll try and check that out in the future, and then, we can always do a little bonus episode on Patreon for some of these movies that we didn't get a chance to cover. This email comes from John from Liverpool. John says, I have to say I was a bit disappointed with this series. Only a handful of films covered are what I would call horror, and those are The Fly, The Brood, Martyrs, Hostel, and Carrie. I've not seen St. Maud or Possessor, but I'm a bit concerned this podcast have veered too much away from the classics of the horror genre and into the more arty stuff, which isn't what we're here for. Hoping for a return to form next series. Well, thank you, John, for that feedback. I don't know what to say to that, really. I feel like just name-checking that 5 films there and saying they're the only horror films covered is a bit harsh. I mean, I know I'm very liberal when it comes to what I would call horror, but I would say that there's probably more than just that little list that are definitely, without a doubt, horror movies that we covered this series. But again, everyone's entitled to their opinion, and as long as you're going to keep listening, and if you're still enjoying the discussions, then great, and hopefully next series we'll be covering more stuff that you are into and that you would consider horror. Off the back of that, I do want to just quickly say, and this isn't in response to you personally, John, this is just something that I've seen a lot of recently on social media in the last couple of years. Maybe it's always been here, I've just become a little bit more aware of it. But, there is a small, usually most of the horror community are so welcoming and are so accepting. But there is a certain element of the horror crowd that are a bit gatekeepery. A friend of mine who's a podcaster recently had this weird sort of thing where she tweeted that she was watching Rosemary's Baby for the first time, and then she got loads of kind of almost abusive responses to that. People being like, you call yourself a horror fan, but you've never seen Rosemary's Baby. And that kind of thing, I never really understand. And there's this idea sometimes from certain people, I think, as to what does and doesn't constitute horror, and therefore what does and doesn't make you a horror fan. I've also seen people on certain groups and, certain corners of social media being like, you are not a legit horror fan if you don't like etc., etc. And actually, usually without fail, the people that say that are the ones that say, if you don't like George Romero, John Carpenter, Dario Argento, usually all of the dudes that made horror in the late 70s and early 80s. And, we're all in agreement that those guys are great, fine. They've made some classics, but horror is so much more than that. And that's what I was trying to prove with this Mind and Body series, is that you can look elsewhere. You don't have to look at the obvious places. You don't have to be massively into giallo and slasher movies and video nasties of the 70s and 80s to be a legit horror fan. Just because a group of vocal, neckbeardy, middle-aged bros on the internet will have you think that, you know. Horror is so broad and so diverse and so interesting, and I think, you know, a lot of people, rightly so, have also only gotten into the horror genre in the last 10 years, and that's because for a lot of people, only now have they started to be able to watch horror films made by people like them. You know, we've got so much more diversity now in the people that make horror films. Look at Babak Anvari, or Nia DaCosta, or Jordan Peele, or Karen Kusama, or all of these other really interesting horror filmmakers that aren't just white dudes, you know? And so I think that at some point we need to stop this idea that the golden age of horror, or the legit era of horror, is the sort of late 70s and early 80s. You know, there's a lot more to it than that, and you don't have to be of that kind of Joe Bob Briggs attitude to be a horror fan. And apologies, John, that wasn't actually aimed at you there. It was just something that sort of struck me in the last couple of weeks. I've seen sort of a lot of talk about this online, so I just wanted to sort of bring that up while I could. Let's move on to this next email from Charlie from New Zealand. Hello, Charlie. Charlie says, I have loved this series, and I have to thank you for what has now become my favourite episode in the history of EOH, your Martyrs conversation with Stacey Ponder and Alex West. This was an absolute joy for me, as my 3 favourite podcasts are EOH, Gaylords of Darkness and Faculty of Horror, and my favourite horror film is Martyrs, so I felt as if this episode was tailor-made for me. I've already re-listened to it 3 times. Holy shit. This leads me to my question. Who have been your favourite guests to record with this series? Or what's been your favourite episode to record and why? Well, thank you so much for that lovely comment, Charlie. And let me answer your question. Now, I'm not going to say who my favourite guests were, because I love them all. I don't have favourites. But if I was to think of what my favourite discussion was, so my favourite sort of film to discuss, I mean, definitely Martyrs with Stacey Ponder and Alex West is up there for me. But I think actually one that really kind of... there are too many, actually, thinking about it. I loved discussing The Silence of the Lambs with Becky, because it's just such a fucking brilliant film. I really loved discussing Videodrome with Matt Glasby. I loved discussing The Fly with James and Matt from Journey Through Sci-Fi. One that really stood out to me, actually, because I don't really like the film, but I really enjoyed the discussion, was talking about The Human Centipede 2 with Dan Martin and Zobo with a Shotgun. It was a really fun conversation, but also one that I personally kind of learned a lot from when talking to Zobo and Dan about it. And I also got to talk to the actor Lawrence Harvey about that film as well. And I think it really kind of opened my eyes to a lot about the film that I hadn't necessarily thought about or appreciated before that. So that really stuck out to me as well. I also loved discussing Under the Skin with Brad, and also getting the chance to chat to Adam Pearson, the actor in that film as well. There are too many to name, I'm afraid, Charlie, but those are a few of my favourites. Thank you so much for that question. This one, along similar lines, comes from Anna Taylor. Anna says, I wanted to thank you once again for a brilliant series. This has been my favourite so far, and one thing I love about this podcast is hearing such a mix of guests with different voices and different backgrounds. Thank you for being a podcast that includes so many female and queer voices in the mix. At the risk of revealing the secrets behind the curtain, I wanted to ask how you go about programming films in each season, and how you make the decision to assign specific films to specific guests. Oh, good question. So let me answer the first part of that first of all. How do I go about picking the films? Well, I guess usually I'll just do a bit of research. So this one is a particularly weird one, The Mind and Body. But if you take Zombies, for example, you know, I think with Zombies, it was quite easy to look up what are the real iconic zombie movies? What were the important ones in the evolution of the subgenre? I guess that's what I look for, first of all, the sort of tentpole movies that are sort of milestones historically, the ones that introduced something new. So you look at the zombie movie and you think, okay, so you've got to do at least one movie from the old voodoo zombie era, right? And then you could talk about maybe Night of the Living Dead as being the first kind of modern zombie movie. Then you probably want to pick at least one late 70s sort of Italian one, because that was really the era where sort of gore was introduced to the zombie movie, and you look at them almost like a series of stepping stones to work out how we get to the zombie movie that we know and love today, I suppose. So first of all, I pick the sort of 5 or 6 key movies that work as sort of the milestones of the subgenre, and then it's a little bit of, me chucking in movies that I personally really love, also movies that a lot of people have written to me and said, oh, I can't wait for you to cover this. I sort of try and cover as many movies as I can that I know people want to hear about. So it's a little bit of everything, really, but the main priority for me is really covering the important movies in a subgenre that push the evolution of that subgenre along a step, I suppose. So sometimes it takes a lot of movie watching and a lot of reading to kind of figure out what those movies are going to be, but it's great fun. I mean, it's one of my favourite things to do, is kind of planning a series. And then when it comes to guests, it's a kind of a mix. What I often try and do initially is look for guests that are experts in that particular field. So of course, when I'm covering a movie like The Exorcist or The Devils, I think, okay, I probably should try and get Mark Kermode for that, right? On the first ever episode where I introduced Giallo and Dario Argento, I got Alan Jones because he is obviously a kind of Argento and Giallo expert. Then there are certain people that, rather than have one particular area of expertise, they've just seen everything. Like, they've seen every movie. So people like Brad Hanson and Giles Edwards are the perfect kind of guests for the sort of also-rans episodes, because you know that they can just reel off a list of kind of obscure recommendations for listeners, So they're perfect for stuff like that because they've got such a big, vast knowledge of films. And then, it's also important to get specific voices for specific subject matters. If you're focusing on maybe a horror film about people of colour, you might want to get a person of colour as a guest. If you're focusing on, for example, when I was doing Roman Polanski's Repulsion, or Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, these were movies where I felt it was important to get women as guests, because there's a lot of tricky, contentious stuff there to talk about that, it's not always as easy when you just get 2 dudes talking about those sorts of movies, right? So it's all about finding the right guest for the right kind of subject matter, I suppose. And I'm very lucky in that I know quite a lot of people now in the horror community and in the film critic community, so I can usually just think, aha, that person would be perfect for this. And then also there are some people that I've kind of just met through the podcast that have since become regular guests on the podcast, just because they're awesome, just because they love the genre and they're so good at chatting about anything, So it's a mix, and everyone has their own strengths, I think, on this podcast, and all of my guests have their own areas of expertise, which I love. So again, that is another thing I absolutely love to do, is to pick certain guests for certain episodes. Such a fun job. So thank you so much for that lovely question, Anna. This email comes from Sean from London. Sean says, Mike, off the back of this fantastic series, I have to thank you. This podcast has consistently introduced me to brilliant horror films I'd never seen before. The folk horror series was a real standout for that. But this series, I'm thrilled to inform you that you've transformed me into a die-hard David Lynch fan. I'm ashamed to say that I was always very dismissive of giving any of his movies any of my time. Maybe I was a little intimidated. I imagined all of his films to be plotless art house movies with no story and nothing to say. This time last year, I had never seen anything made by Lynch. But listening to you and your guests talk about him in such an enthusiastic and accessible way, particularly in a horror context, gave me the push I needed. I started by watching Twin Peaks and following along with your Patreon miniseries, which I believe was the perfect way into his work. I couldn't believe how accessible, how funny, and how entertaining this series was, not to mention absolutely terrifying. I binge-watched all of Twin Peaks and The Return in a matter of weeks. Then I began watching his movies, starting with Eraserhead, working my way through all the way to Inland Empire. The only 2 movies I skipped are Dune and The Straight Story. I would now consider Lynch to be one of my absolute favourite filmmakers. Every time I watch a movie of his, I'm terrified, moved, and transfixed. Hearing you and your guests break down his films on the podcast has also given me an extra appreciation for films like Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive. So, I know you didn't ask for it, but here are my top 5 Lynch projects. Love this. Number 5, Blue Velvet. Number 4, Mulholland Drive. Number 3, Inland Empire. Ooh. Number 2, Twin Peaks. And number 1, Lost Highway. Keep up the great work and can't wait to be introduced to new movies and new filmmakers next season. Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Sean. That email is absolute music to my ears. Obviously, I am in love with David Lynch and I've loved indulging in his movies, and I thank all of you for letting me indulge in so many Lynch films this series. And just the idea that this time last year, Sean, you had never seen a David Lynch film, and now you're a fan and you've watched all of these movies and TV shows is I honestly could not be happier. Also, what a great top 5. I love that you've got Inland Empire as your number 3. So, that's a difficult film. I would love to know a bit more, Sean. What is it you loved about Inland Empire so much? And, number 1, Lost Highway. Can't argue with that. What a fucking terrifying movie that is. Thank you so much for that lovely email. This next one comes from Ryan MacArthur. Ryan says, "This is the most informative and intense season that we've had yet on this pod. I was psyched for this topic because Eraserhead is one of the most affecting films I've ever seen. As this season went on, I was moved out of my comfort zone, seeing Martyrs for the first time and spiraling into the world of Asian horror. I was crossing my fingers that you would include my all-time favourite film, The Lighthouse, in this season, hoping that instead we may get a season on LGBT representation in horror, and that we get to talk about Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe smooching. Thank you so much for putting yourself through all of these films. It's nice to have the option of watching or not watching, something that you don't get to enjoy. P.S. Dream Warriors episodes are my favourites. Becky is the funniest of all time." Thank you so much, Ryan. What a lovely email. Dream Warriors episodes are probably my favourites to record as well, to be honest. For anyone who doesn't know, because they're mainly on Patreon, I've been doing a kind of a run of episodes with Stevie Webb and Becky Dark. We called ourselves the Dream Warriors because we covered Nightmare on Elm Street Dream Warriors, and since then we've reunited to talk about different 80s slasher movies, and we've kind of made them calendar specific, kind of Hallmark horror films. So we did Silent Night Deadly Night at Christmas. We have just done My Bloody Valentine for Valentine's Day, and we've got another one coming up very soon, so stay tuned for that. Thank you, Ryan. Now, you are absolutely right, and if I have one regret, actually, it's that I didn't do a deep dive discussion on The Lighthouse, because I love The Lighthouse, and I love that it's your favourite movie of all time, Ryan. And you're right, there's some really interesting queer stuff going on in that film. I also love Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe smooching. It's such a good film, and I will find a way to cover it in depth at some point in the future, whether it's just a one-off on Patreon, or maybe, that suggestion is really interesting. LGBT horror films. Who knows? I'll have a think, but I will try and cover The Lighthouse in the future, because that was a bit of an oversight on my part. It does fit this season perfectly. I briefly mentioned it in the psychological horror also rans episode, but it deserves more. Thank you so much, Ryan, for that email. This comes from Ed from Southampton, and he says, "I've loved this series with the exception of one episode. Why did you decide to cover Hostel if you and your guest were just going to shit on it for the entire episode?" Well, thank you, Ed, for that brief, succinct email. I don't like Hostel, but I think it's an important film to cover. Whether I like it or not, Hostel was a huge, important milestone in the horror genre, particularly in the decade of the 2000s. It kind of sums up that decade in American horror, I would say. So I thought it was important to talk about, and there are interesting things you can talk about with that film. And my guest, Adam Robinson, is one of the most smart and cine-literate people I know, and he wrote a dissertation on torture porn. I stand by the fact that he was the best, perfect guest to talk about that film with me. yes, neither of us liked that film, but I like to think, maybe I'm wrong, I like to think that we did have enough stuff to say about it that was of interest, that wasn't just quote-unquote shitting on the film. I know that obviously it's never nice to hear, a film that you love being pretty harshly critiqued, I suppose. And I totally understand that. And, to be honest, most of you that have written in have agreed with me and Adam about that film. It feels like a lot of horror fans that listen to this podcast don't really like that kind of Eli Roth era of horror and don't really like Hostel. But many of you probably do love it. And if you send me some emails explaining why it's a good film, I will happily read them, and maybe I'll find time to read them out on the podcast as well. Convince me, Ed. Convince me why Hostel is not worthy of harsh criticism. Let me know. Finally, then, I'm going to finish with this email from Hannah Nixon. Hannah says, before lockdown, if you'd asked me, I'd have said I'm not into horror, because in my mind, after the excellent slashers of my youth, like Scream, it became a byword for Saw, Hostel-style torture porn, which I'm really not into. But when my old screenwriting teacher said he was running a horror writing course, shout out to David Lemon, I thought it would be good to stretch myself. Immediately after I started the course, I kept finding myself listing films I love that are horror. Irreversible, Under the Skin. And I realised too late in the day that my David Lynch obsession isn't just about coffee and Audrey Horne, but rooted in the horror of the uncanny. I found EOH and immediately signed up for the Patreon, the only podcast I pay for, but I really think your work deserves to be paid. Thank you, Hannah. I really love Mary Wild's interludes, and it's led me to her podcast as well. The Mind and Body series couldn't have been more up my street, and I really value what you do and how you do it. Finding EOH has been such a surprising and lovely part of this lockdown year. I'm a playwright and screenwriter, and though my funding for my first directed short disappeared last year, I'm hoping to get it going again, and I'd love to send you the finished film when it's done, which is going to be a horror. Hannah, thank you so much for that lovely email, and please, please, please send me your short horror film. I would love to see it, and then maybe you can come on the podcast and discuss it at some point. So there you go. Thank you to everybody for sending in their emails, whether it's telling me how much you hated this series or loved it. I always love hearing from everybody, so thank you so much to all of you for getting in touch. Now, many of you who sent in emails also sent in your top 5s and top 10s, so I'm now going to count down the listeners' top 10 mind and body movies. Now, this was a particularly difficult one to collate because it's such a strange amorphous subgenre or pair of subgenres. I wasn't quite sure how to approach it. I didn't know whether to maybe separate them and do a top 5 mind and a top 5 body, but then I realised when people were sending in their lists, they were having trouble separating them, and there are so many films that tick both boxes. So I've just merged all of the lists together, whether you separated them or whether you sent them as one list. I've combined them from lists that we received on Twitter, on the Facebook discussion group, and on email. We've had, I think, just looking at the spreadsheet, nearly 400 different lists that I've kind of attempted to collate. So this was really fascinating because I think this, of course, of all series we've done so far, I absolutely had no idea what was going to become number one. You know, when you do folk horror, you kind of assume The Wicker Man is going to come out on top, or when you do slasher movies, you assume Halloween is going to come out on top, or with a cult, it's going to be The Exorcist. With this, it could literally have been anything. So I was so excited and really pleased to see what ended up in your top 10 mind and body movies. So here we go. I'm going to run down your list and I will try and read a few comments from you guys as we go. At number 10 on your list, you voted for Clive Barker's Hellraiser.
Perhaps we prefer you. I want to hear him confess himself. Then, maybe. But if you hate us... will tear your soul apart.
What an excellent film and an excellent choice by you guys. Of course, this is one of my personal favourite ever horror movies. I've been so excited to finally discuss it on the podcast of this series, and I'm so glad so many of you guys love this film too. Patrick Thompson says, "This is the film I've been waiting for you to cover since the podcast began. It's a strange, gruesome and compelling horror movie that defies any kind of categorization. So I guess it was the perfect choice for a season of films that all defy categorizations." And Quincy said, "I watched this movie for the first time during this series and couldn't believe how good it was. In my head, this was going to be yet another slasher-style gore movie about a monster called Pinhead. But instead, I got something completely different, a psychosexual exploration of pain, pleasure, and female desire about a monster called Julia. It's now one of my all-time favourite horror movies." Jason Williams says, "Love this movie and so excited that we're going to get a Patreon miniseries exploring the franchise. These films are strange, queasy, masochistic, and fascinating. And the first one is unbeatable." So there we go. Your number 10 pick was Hellraiser. So glad you guys enjoyed it. Thank you for your comments. And as Jason said, over on Patreon, I am going to be working my way through the whole Hellraiser series that was voted for by you guys. So over the next few months, we will be bringing you a Hellraiser retrospective mini-season. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, at number 9. Now, this one has really made me happy because this is a very divisive movie. It's a movie that I thought too many of you would have not liked, so I didn't expect to see it this high on the list. But at number 9, you guys voted for Andrzej Zulawski's Possession.
But if you really thought about it, you'd think about it.
Right, you're always right. But it's difficult, don't you understand? It is difficult. I didn't want it to happen, but it happened, and now. But don't you come any closer?
Anna, it's me.
But don't you understand? You disgust me. I can't stand.
This has got to be one of the strangest movies I have ever covered on the podcast, and I'm so glad that there is so much love for it here. Just going to read a few of the many comments that we've had on this movie over the last year or so. Damon Rickard said, "Insane but brilliant film." Howard David Ingham said, "My favourite horror movie, bar none." Michael J says, "Only saw it for the first time last year, and it's instantly gone in as one of my favourite films of all time." Giles Edwards has called it genuine, troubling masterpiece. Gregor Gregorovich, I think that's how you pronounce your surname, said, "I hated it as I was first watching it. Once I stopped trying to figure it out and let the visuals influence me emotionally, then it made sense. The more I thought about it afterwards, the more elements of it came together. Now I love it. After hearing a discussion with Mike and Anna, it confirmed everything stunning about it, and now I think it's a truly brilliant movie." Rebecca McCallum said, "I felt possessed by this film after watching. Very few films leave me shaken up, but this was one of them." Andy Lewin says, "Bonkers and pretentious in the best possible way. Also, it made me feel okay about dating a large monster with tentacles straight out of a Lovecraftian nightmare." Yeah, we've all been there, Andy. And finally, Carlos Segura says, "One of my top 10 movies of all time, period. I own the gorgeous limited edition by Mondo Digital, wrote about it back in college, and have seen it on the big screen a couple of times. I deeply love this movie." So there you go. I'm so happy that so many of you have so much love for this weird little film. Your number 9 is Possession. At number 8, we have your first, but not your last, David Cronenberg movie. At number 8, you guys voted for none other than Videodrome.
Therefore, whatever appears on the television screen emerges as raw experience for those who watch it. Therefore, television is reality, and reality is less than television. Max, I'm so glad you came to me. I've been through it all myself, you see.
What a film. I mean, for me personally, this is a film that I kind of didn't really get that on board with the first time I watched it, and then have kind of liked it more and more on every subsequent viewing. And this last time I watched it for the podcast, I just absolutely fell head over heels in love with it. So I'm so glad you guys love it too. Michelle Kerr says, I watched it during lockdown for the first time and loved it. Felt even more powerful in its message in today's current climate, and it stuck with me for days. Also, Blondie. Yeah, couldn't agree more, Michelle. Tarquin Mandrake said, a visionary masterpiece. David Cronenberg peaked here. Peter Jetnikov said, Videodrome was the first David Cronenberg movie I saw. It got a small art house release in 1984. I had just graduated from my film media BA, and the ideas in the film felt thrilling and forbidden. When I later put myself on a course of Cronenberg, I went through the first few and enjoyed seeing how Cronenberg developed, with the single most noticeable leap being Videodrome. And a lot of that has to do with the charisma of James Woods, whose performance, I will agree, allows us to follow him regardless of how little we like him. With that great casting decision, the myriad of ideas of this difficult story all get a solid look in. Like Eraserhead or Come and See, I've had a copy of this movie in every format, from VHS to Criterion Blu-ray, a desert island film. Thank you, Peter, and thank you to all of you for those lovely comments. So there you go. At number 8, you guys voted it. It's Videodrome. Okay, we go from Cronenberg to Lynch for number 7. So glad this is so high on your list. At number 7, you guys voted for Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me. I will not drone on about how much I love this film. I've talked about it ad nauseum already at this point. I will just read a couple of your comments. Brian Kerr says, no matter what you think of the film as a whole, it contains the scariest moment in cinema, when Laura arrives home, peeps into her bedroom to find someone standing behind her chest of drawers. Trina Findley says, first time around I struggled to follow all the storylines, and I found that there was so much going on that it was an assault on my senses, as is Lynch's wont. Second time around, and after listening to you and Anna break it down, I felt a bit more prepared, and I just went along for the ride. Absolutely loved it, and the portrayal of Laura Palmer's swift descent into her own hell really affected me in a way that previous watches hadn't. And I'll just read this one last comment from Andy Lewin, who says, Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me is the greatest film ever made. Ooh, there you go. I'm over the moon at the love for Fire Walk with Me. That was your number 7. Moving up to your number 6 then. Another brilliant film. So glad you guys enjoyed it. I mean, you guys have got such good taste. At number 6, you voted for Jonathan Glazer's Under the Skin. Michael Cool says, seeing Under the Skin on the big screen was one of the most disturbing and immersive viewing experiences I've ever had. I haven't seen it since it came out, but I remember it being grey and foggy on the bus home. I live in Scotland, not far from where parts of it were filmed, and I definitely found it considerably more difficult than normal to get to sleep for the rest of the week. George Fox says, Under the Skin is one of my favourite films. The soundtrack is a top 5 soundtrack ever for me, and I think the true genius is the casting of Scarlett Johansson. We're so used to seeing her on screen, and Glasgow is shot in a way that places just aren't shot in ScarJo movies. It creates this amazing dissonance where the superstar celebrity feels like the ordinary element wandering through a completely out of the ordinary location that feels like you're witnessing an alien civilization. Whereas in fact, the opposite of true, she's the one that's out of place in an environment that should appear completely mundane. A true masterpiece. So there you go. Thank you for those comments. And that was your number 6 choice, The Brilliant Under the Skin. At number 5, oh God, I love this film too. It's Carrie from 1976. The ultimate mind and body movie as far as I'm concerned. I love Brian De Palma's Carrie so much, and clearly so do you guys. Duncan Maitland said, Carrie, an incredible film. Every time I see it, I hope things are going to turn out differently. And Pino Donaggio's best score too, for my money. Trina Findley says, Carrie is just such a film for me. A film I first watched when I was 10 on a tiny black and white portable in my room. I was absolutely captivated by Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie. It was the first film to scare me so much I had to sleep with the lights on for weeks, particularly that last jump scare. And James Dillon says, as beautiful and heartbreaking as it is terrifying, Sissy Spacek might give the single greatest performance in the history of horror, somehow managing to be weird, alienating, terrifying, but also so human and so sympathetic. Couldn't agree more with all of those comments. What an incredible performance. What an incredible film. Your number 5 mind and body movie, Brian De Palma's Carrie. Okay, moving up to number 4. And again, I cannot believe that so many of you voted for this movie and it's so high on your list. A strange little art house midnight movie from 1977. At your number 4, David Lynch's Eraserhead.
Do you mind just cut them up like regular chickens?
Sure, just cut them up like regular chickens.
And there you go. Spoiler alert, this is the highest David Lynch movie on your list. I can't believe it, but I love that you guys have voted for Eraserhead. James Rodriguez said, my first watch of Eraserhead was 6 years ago. I was completely unprepared for what it would be like and came out at the end unsure of what to think. My second watch was last night, and I was a lot more on the film's wavelength. The look in Jack Nance's eyes captured so much of his horror about fatherhood, and I felt so sorry for the baby. He can't help how he looks. I cannot wait for my third watch. Hunter Robinson says, this film is a masterpiece, one of the greatest debuts ever. It's funny, terrifying, and the sound design and visuals are unique and effective. The second time I watched it, my wife and I were expecting our first baby, and it made the experience even more impactful. Peter Jetnikoff simply says, my favourite film ever. And Grant Kennedy says, absolutely love it. A nightmarish, horrific, enigmatic work of genius. So there you go. Couldn't agree more, of course, with all of those comments. Your number 4 pick was David Lynch's Eraserhead. Okay, number 3. Now, for number 3, we're moving into the extreme cinema era of our Mind and Body series. So much love for this film. So many of you guys voted for it and included it on your lists. At number 3, you voted for Pascal Laugier's Martyrs. Oof, what a movie. Hunter Robinson says, I saw Martyrs at a film festival. It was an afternoon screening, and I remember not wanting to see or talk to anyone afterwards. An incredible experience, but a film I have never revisited. Elizabeth Brozek says, I knew a lot about it before seeing it. I'm a spoiler queen. Even knowing what was going to happen, it still hit hard. Most movies don't do the same. Tim Ackerman said, one of the few grueling torture films that I didn't regret seeing through to the end. Few horror films can go from being terrifying to devastated to somehow transcendent and spiritual, all within the space of 90 minutes. A film that literally journeys from the mind to the body and ultimately the soul. It's quite simply the best and most terrifying horror film of the 21st century. Wow, I'm so glad that so many of you have so much love for Martyrs. For me, it's a movie like no other, one that affected me more than any movie I've ever seen in my life. So there you go. Your number 3 pick was Pascal Laugier's Martyrs. For your top 2, really interestingly, it just so happens that we've got one psychological horror and one body horror. At number 2, a movie that so often gets called a psychological thriller, you voted for the perfect movie that is The Silence of the Lambs.
Oh, Agent Starling, you think you can dissect me with this blunt little tool?
No. I thought that your knowledge...
You're so ambitious, aren't you? Do you know what you look like to me with your good bag and your cheap shoes? You look like a rube. A well-scrubbed, hustling rube with a little taste. Good nutrition's given you some length of bone, but you're not more than one generation from poor white trash, are you, Agent Starling? And that accent you've tried so desperately to shed, pure West Virginia. What does your father do? Is he a coal miner? Does he stink of the land? You know how quickly the boys found you, all those tedious, sticky fumblings in the backseats of cars, while you could only dream of getting out, getting anywhere, getting all the way to the apple pie.
Well, there we go. The one time the Academy got it right. One of the most critically acclaimed horror movies ever made. I mean, there's no one who doesn't love this film, right? Everyone loves this film. It's pretty much perfect. And I'm going to read some comments that pretty much back up that opinion. So Vincent Gain says, a taut, terse, tense and terrifying nightmare of body and mind. Paul Bow has said, there's not a single element of this film that isn't perfect. Not just the greatest horror film ever made, but the greatest film ever made. Sandy B says, the film that defies categorization, partly a gothic horror about a monster who eats people, partly a police procedural about a woman in a patriarchal system. Whether it's thriller or horror or both or neither, there's no denying The Silence of the Lambs is absolute perfection. There you go. Well, couldn't agree more with all of those comments. I love The Silence of the Lambs so much, and that was your number 2. So there you go. All that's left is number 1. What did you guys vote as your favourite mind and body movie? Before we get to the number 1, I'm going to read a few honourable mentions that didn't quite make it into your top 10. So speaking of Silence of the Lambs, David Fincher's Seven, it got a lot of love, but it didn't quite make it into the top 10. Other new French extremity films also got quite a few votes, like Inside and Trouble Every Day, but none of them got quite enough. David Lynch movies like Blue Velvet and Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive, again, they all got a few votes. Maybe they sort of split the votes, I don't know, but none of those got enough to be in the top 10. A lot of love, actually, in terms of films that we didn't cover. Once again, The Lighthouse is a film that a lot of you put in your top 10s. Again, such an oversight on my part. I should have done a deep dive into The Lighthouse. I will try and find time for that in the future. Dead Ringers also got quite a few votes, but not quite enough. A couple of old classics as well. Carnival of Souls, Les Diaboliques, and Repulsion. There was a lot of love for all of these movies, but none of them quite made it into your top 10. So, what did you vote as the number 1 mind and body horror movie? Well, it's a fantastic choice, and I would firmly place this one front and center in the body horror category, although of course it does tick both boxes. You voted as your number 1 David Cronenberg's The Fly.
Have you ever heard of insect politics? Neither have I. Insects don't have politics. They're very brutal. No compassion. No compromise. We can't trust the insect. I'd like to become the first insect politician. You see, I'd like to, but, I'm afraid,
I don't know what you're trying to say.
I'm saying, I'm an insect who dreamt he was a man and loved it. But now the dream is over and the insect is awake.
No, sir.
I'm saying, I'll hurt you this day.
What a film. Heartbreaking, beautiful, terrifying, and gross. So glad that so many of you guys have so much love for this movie. And there you go, David Cronenberg came out on top. I guess that's only right, really, considering the subject matter. So Grace Kerr says, The Fly is perfect. Perfect in every way. It needed only be half as good as it was and would have still been great. Not only that, Cronenberg did not shortchange the mainstream audience either. And The Fly did so well for such an extreme movie. I rewatched it the other day and I cried for its perfection. There's humanity and there's stuff that reads like the greatest literature. This was a non-mainstream director who did off-the-wall movies, was given a decent studio budget, and instead of screwing it up, delivered a masterpiece. Such heart. Perfectly put, Grace. Derv Arch says, complete perfection. One of the most sympathetic character portrayals in horror history. Sarah Forgren says, this is a perfect and amazing film that I only watch about once every 10 years. I rewatched in preparation for listening to the episode and it's still such a fantastic movie. Nico Ewok says, probably my favourite ever film. Although how does anyone just pick one? My first recommendation to any horror newbies or skeptics. It was part of what got me into horror. So there you go. And I think all of you touch upon that there in a way, that idea that The Fly being a sort of mainstream movie by a sort of underground director. And it's a film about a man turning into an insect starring Jeff Goldblum. It sounds like a silly mainstream B movie, but it's beautiful and it's gut-wrenching and it's devastating and it's got some of the most beautiful and poetic dialogue you'll have ever heard. I'm really just echoing what you've all just said there, but I couldn't agree more. So there you go. I'm going to run through your top 10 one more time from 10 down to 1. So voted for by all of you guys, your top 10 mind and body horrors. At number 10, Hellraiser. Number 9, Possession. Number 8, Videodrome. Number 7, Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me. Number 6, Under the Skin. Number 5, Carrie. Number 4, Eraserhead. Number 3, Martyrs. Number 2, The Silence of the Lambs. And number 1, The Fly. What an incredible list. Those are 10 5-star movies as far as I'm concerned. Just goes to show what a joy it's been doing this series. So thank you all so much for listening and thank you all so much for voting. Before we finish, I'm going to very quickly run down my top 10. I won't talk too much about any of these because you've heard me talk about all of these movies for the best part of a year now, but I will quickly run down my choices from 10 to 1. At number 10, I went with Audition, Takashi Miike's Audition. Actually quite surprised that didn't make it onto your list. At number 9, Jonathan Glazer's Under the Skin. At number 8, I've gone with Cronenberg's Videodrome, just perfection. Number 7, Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me. So scary, so beautiful. Number 6, I've gone with another Lynch film, Lost Highway. For me, that's one of his most baffling, terrifying masterpieces. Number 5, I've gone with Hellraiser. I mean, just a perfect movie. Number 4, I've gone with Martyrs. It's an incredibly difficult movie to watch, but a brilliant one. Number 3, I've gone with Carrie. Just, I think, sort of in many ways, the perfect blend of mind and body horror. Number 2, I've gone with Blue Velvet. That's the highest Lynch entry on my list. And number 1, I cannot disagree with you guys. It's David Cronenberg's The Fly. It's the best Cronenberg film. It's the best body horror film. And for my money, it is the best movie that falls under any of these categories. My number 1 and your number 1 mind and body movie, David Cronenberg's The Fly. And there we go. That's it for this week and for this series. We are going to be off the air for a couple of months. But, of course, in the meantime, if you want to carry on listening to episodes, then sign up to our Patreon. Over on patreon.com/evolutionofhorror, we will still be bringing you at least 2 bonus episodes per month for $5 donors, or a new episode every single week if you're a $10 donor. So please sign up and get involved. Patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. And don't forget, you can find us on all the social media platforms. Keep following us and keep up to date while we're on a hiatus, because that's how you'll be the first to know if there are any updates. So we're on Facebook, that's facebook.com/evolutionofhorror. We're on Instagram @evolutionofhorror. We're on Twitter @evolutionpod, and we're on Letterboxd @evolutionpod. You can find all previous episodes and seasons of this podcast, as well as everything else EOH related, on our website. That's evolutionofhorror.com. And you can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, Acast, Libsyn, Spotify, and several others. And of course, more than anything right now, we would be hugely grateful for a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, especially when we're not churning out weekly content. This is a great way for us to be discovered by new listeners. So there you go, that's the end of Series 6 of the Evolution of Horror. Now it's time for me to tell you a little bit about Series 7. Now, if you follow us on social media, you'll probably already know about this. If you're a Patreon subscriber, you'll probably already know about this, and we've mentioned it in passing a couple of times on the main podcast. But next series, I think, is the perfect antidote to what we've been discussing this series. From a whole season of films that focus very much on inner space, next series, we're venturing into outer space. Next series, we are going to be focusing on all things aliens, okay? Aliens and other worldly monsters. Now, of course, that means that we'll be covering some of the absolute classics, such as Ridley Scott's Alien and, at long last, I know many of you have been waiting for it, John Carpenter's The Thing, as well as a whole bunch of kind of 50s alien classics like War of the Worlds, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Blob, and a bunch of recent classics as well, like Cloverfield and 10 Cloverfield Lane, A Quiet Place, and M. Night Shyamalan's Signs. But it's not just going to be strictly aliens from outer space. It can be a movie about any other worldly monster. So within that, we're also including a kind of Lovecraftian monster element. I guess you might want to call it cosmic horror, like Alex Garland's Annihilation and Frank Darabont's The Mist. In short, we've got some absolute incredible movies, and, of course, many incredible guests. So keep an eye out. That series will be kicking off later on this year in the summer. But until then, it's time to lay Season 6 to rest. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, be kind to your own minds and your own bodies. They're the only ones you've got. Join us again soon for another series of the Evolution of Horror.